Elaine Storkey. I'm an academic, actually a philosopher initially, but also a social scientist and a theologian. And I'm a writer and a broadcaster. And welcome to Spring Harvest. I hope you're enjoying Spring Harvest. I hope you're enjoying the worship and the prayer times and also engaging with us in seminars. We're really enjoying putting the seminars together for you. Well, my seminar is on post-truth. And truth is a very important concept for us as Christians because we believe the truth. We believe that God is a God of truth and Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So when we talk about post-truth, immediately alarm bells start to ring for us. What does post mean in post-truth? Well, post means after. It's a kind of condition, it's a society, it's a way of life that comes after truth is finished, or after truth no longer matters in the way that it did before. And so there's a definition, there's a description of the society that goes along something like this, and I'll read it to you. Truth is losing its value as societies reserve currency. Legitimate skepticism is yielding place to pernicious relativism. And this writer says it follows on almost naturally from our postmodern condition. Now, is that true? And in a certain sense, it's both true and untrue. It certainly is losing its currency in society, but it's not an automatic following from a postmodern context. Postmodernity doesn't have to lead to post-truth. Post-truth is a different kind of development. And also, post-truth has been around really rather a longer time than since postmodernity started. We might argue that post-truth has been challenged for decades, sometimes longer than that, and on a national and international level. If you go back to the last century and look at the propaganda war between the two great superpowers of the time, the United States and Russia, and how these actually featured in the post-war, Cold War period. Extraordinary what went on during that period. Both Russia and the United States are now seen to have sacrificed truth in their big debate with each other. The USSR was seen as a monolith of communism, of state control and so on, and the United States was seen as a monolith of individualist capitalism, and the two clashed head-on in a whole range of different ways. The McCarthy era in the United States went after anybody that it didn't trust, whether those people were people like Paul Robeson or Charlie Chaplin, because they were suspected of being communists, and that meant they were traitors. Whether or not they were communists, whether they had any interest at all in the USSR, was always a very moot point. The United States was so pro-capitalist that those who benefited from that capitalism actually ran the show during this period, and they were in charge. So Russia was then, the USSR and state communism were depicted as the enemy. And a whole range of contrasting words which epitomized, for America at least, the dichotomy between them and the USSR were bandied around as though they were truth. So America saw itself as democratic over and against Russia that it saw as totalitarian. America saw itself as free over and against Russia, which it saw as exercising state control. So freedom of the individual over and against the state control of Russia, or the USSR. And actually, similarly, Russia had the same kind of suspicions and antagonisms towards America too. And they weren't just words. They were taken into whole ways of living and ways of operating. They were taken right into the Cold War, into this race for space. There was competitions as to who would get to the moon first and who would send rockets out and bring data back. And even more perniciously, of course, into the arms race, who would rearm, who would have the biggest arsenals, who will be there with their nuclear bombs all on the ready. And in all of this, the truth was spun. the truth about the different locations and the different desires and meanings of these groups was actually often way away from the mark. And the purpose of the sacrifice of this truth was, of course, national self-interest. It was self-aggrandizement, but it was also a bid for moral supremacy. To establish your country as occupying the moral high ground was worth telling a few lies to the public or hiding a few things that you didn't necessarily want the public, the electorate, to know. Even telling some things that are quite opposite to the truth was hushed up in order to keep the model intact. So if you lived in the West in the 1950s, which I did, I was a child, but I was a child afraid of the Soviet Empire, terrified when you saw these pictures on screens of jackboots and big arsenals and weapons and so on. And they paraded their weapons right down the public square. But actually, America had more than they did, more than they did, and they were more powerful. And we never saw those kinds of things on the screen because we kept fairly quiet about the West and the things that we were doing wrong. So the USSR was evil. They were communists and they were out to get us. And of course, historians now challenge an awful lot of what was propagandized in the Cold War period and have unpacked it and looked at the facts in a much more historical and careful way, and have come up with very different attitudes and very different readings of the whole situation. I think also when you look at what's happened during these periods, it wasn't just big national events, it wasn't just things like the Cold War that have actually challenged our understanding and our reflections to truth, but it was things like advertising, the growth of advertising. And advertising has become incredibly powerful over the years, and especially over the last 50, 60 years, and that too reflects our understanding of truth. Right at the very beginning, the purpose of advertising was to inform. It was to get across facts, details, so that you would look at this goods, product, whatever it was you were purporting to sell, in a favourable light. But it wanted to give you as much information as you can so that you could base your choice whether to buy or not to buy on strong, rational grounds. And you can see this in some of the early advertising. So look at this advertisement for Parker Pen. How many pens would that sell today? It would take ages just to work through the writing on the advertisement itself. And similarly with adverts like L'Oreal. The early L'Oreal adverts were wordy, but they were also glamorous of a kind, but they had already stopped at a certain point that needed to be taken on much further. Now, advertising made claims for the product they were selling, and of course the claims were often very exaggerated and got more and more exaggerated as time went on. But advertising itself became very different from those early days of information and imparting truth about something. Advertising became much more about a narrative, finding a story that would sell the product. But also it became not about disseminating truth, but actually about communication, about selling something much bigger than the product, selling identity, selling romance, selling love, and eventually finding a slogan that would work and would carry you through. And what Marshall McLuhan used to call way back in the last century, cool communication, is now the background of all advertising. You don't need all the words. And sometimes the words that you need are nothing to do with the product. And so look at these two more recent advertisements for L'Oreal. One is very glamorous, that's the kind of mid-period, somewhere way back in the last century. But today, it's now used as a public service because everybody knows, because you're worth it. Because you're worth it means L'Oreal and against COVID-19. There are other forms of communication that belong to our postmodern era that I would also argue are not post-truth, and in particular forms of communication that have grown up amongst young people. Young people using their smartphones or their iPads or their various devices to reach other young people. And it's all part of gaming. It's part of creating a private language, a private communication pattern that they're in the know, and those older ones who are outside the know haven't a clue what's going on. Let me give you a couple of examples. I'm sure you've seen them before. There's, of course, the lolcats. The lolcats are the ones that just are there on screen, and whenever when you're bored or have time on your hands, you'll send your friend a lolcat meme. Here's one: I'm in your folder corrupting your files, and there's the lolcat. So what is that about? What's it saying? Well, actually nothing in particular. It's just an image that actually makes somebody feel good and feel connected to the person who's sending it, and they'll pass it on to yet another person. And as well as all the lolcat memes, there's also the planking memes, and that's in this next picture. And that awkward moment when you don't know whether your grandma is planking or dead. I mean, as a grandma, I should take exception to this, but I don't. I think it's huge fun, and I wouldn't mind planking occasionally. But what is planking? Well, planking is clearly pretending to be dead in this case. And again, it's there to enact humour, to build up a relationship, to be there as part of postmodern communication. Is it post-truth? No, it's nothing to do with that. In a sense, it's not either lying nor telling the truth. It's creating an association. It's creating an ambience that people can feel good about each other and enjoy the relationship, which to some extent, again, is a private relationship, although a very public one by now. So we need a new definition of post-truth to help us on our way through the minefield of communication that we're looking at. And I like Matthew Dancona's one better than most because it does incorporate several elements that I think are absolutely vital. Let me read it to you. What we have seen is a crash in the value of truth comparable to the collapse of a currency or a stock. Political lies, spin and falsehood are emphatically not the same as post-truth. What is new is not the mendacity of politicians, but the public's response to it. Lying is regarded as the norm, even in democracies. So he's distancing post-truth from propaganda, from spin, from falsehood that's always been there as part of the apparatus of politicians. And he's actually talking now about how we respond to it, how we accept or reject this whole idea of truth as it's been disseminated to us. I think it's quite important to look at what he's referring to. And of course, post-truth was very important in 2016 and 17 because claims were being made, truth claims were being made, which were clearly false. And they were being made very often on a national or sometimes even international scale and stage. Take, for example, President Trump's claim that in his inauguration, the crowds were there bigger than ever any previous presidential inauguration. And swiftly on the heels of this assertion, of course, were the people with cameras who'd been there, taken cameras from various sites, helicopters, vantage points and so on, and had photographed the crowds. And they were very quick to posit these in the public arena. So here on this image, you get the crowds that were present at the Trump inauguration, and you can see a vast swathe of empty space compared with the crowds that were present at the Obama inauguration, where the space is filled with bodies, with people celebrating the presidency of President Obama. Now, why did that get by? Why was it that Trump was able to continue to assert that his presidency had been so well received and so well celebrated when clearly you have the factual evidence that this was not true? And it's because people chose to accept what he said over and against the truth of the image. And very often then the experts who produce the truth are downplayed or decried, whether it's scientific truth, whether it's truth about the economy, whether it's truth about popularity, or even about what somebody said, it becomes attacked. Countering untruth, countering post-truth, on the international stage is more difficult because of the rise of social media. There's no possibility of checking every purported fact that is offered to us on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or any of the other various social media forms. We have to take a large amount of them, a large number of them, at face value. So why do we take them at face value, and what do we do with them? And it's very interesting that what we tend to do, we accept things as part of a narrative. The narrative that says, this is the whole package that we go with. We either trust the person who is speaking or we don't. If we trust them, then in a very real sense, we don't question whether or not what they're saying is true or false. We just go along with it. And sometimes we know it's not true, but frankly, it doesn't matter that much. And that's the issue. It doesn't matter that much whether it's true or not. And the whole concept of the narrative, as we see in this next slide, the narrative has become all-powerful in political life. The anti-establishment political right have the most potent narrative going, says this particular critic, who of course isn't from the anti-establishment political right, and that's why he's saying that. But this attack on what was deemed to be the establishment was usually carried out by an alternative establishment that had found out how to win the approval of the people. And they had done this by naming dissatisfactions, by pointing the finger of blame at the establishments that had not contested these dissatisfactions or changed them, by positioning themselves as the new champions of the people, and by focusing on those institutions or areas of life that were very important to the people in order to be safeguarded and to be shown that they were all in this together. Of course, we learned as societies went on and that wherever these establishment changes had taken place, that the new establishment very often had more power, more wealth, more prestige, and certainly more access to the media than the old establishments. And so it was hardly a new popular uprising. But what's even more important from our point of view of the seminar is that these new establishments were very happy to embrace post-truth. They didn't mind twisting the truth, spinning, putting a different view on things if it got the message across that they were indeed people of the people. So let's look at some of the ways in which they did this. We all now know that the bus image in the Brexit campaign was untrue. This large amount of money was not going to go to the NHS, and in fact the figures were disputed almost as soon as they were printed. But by and large, it didn't matter. It was there, it was being shown, and the association of a freedom from Brexit, freedom from the EU, and a rise in the power of our NHS had been firmly established in people's minds. It's also very important that this, of course, was a bus slogan. Buses have been very effective in advertising. Buses are things of the people. They're what ordinary people ride in. Ordinary people don't ride in limousines or don't ride in chauffeur-driven cars or jet airplanes that they happen to have lying around in their back garden. They ride on buses. So putting in the slogans on a bus is very effective. This isn't the first time it had been used, of course. Richard Dawkins found this out some years before in his bus campaign, dreamed up by one of his followers, that if they could actually put things on a bus and drive them around, it will soak into people's psyche and their way of seeing things. And so you've had lots of bus campaigns. There's probably no God, so just forget about it and enjoy life was a big, important campaign. And it was never going to be long before someone came along and put both buses together. There's probably no God, but there's definitely no £350 million for the NHS. So let's take back control. And then other responses to those issues in the bus ads. There's lolcats back again. There's probably no dog, so stop being curious and enjoy your 9 lives. Or Noel Ford. There's probably no bus, so come into church and enjoy yourselves for a bit. And of course, buses are always very good places for planking. So these kinds of humour actually constitute a rejection of post-truth. they're undermining it in a cultural form of way as part of an alternative culture. But they don't make the impact that's necessary into culture as a whole, because post-truth is upheld by so many people in the population if what they're hearing is what they want to hear, and if already they've suspended their disbelief because they want to follow their leader, as it were. And in no area are the experts, when they're derided and attacked, in no area is it more difficult to withstand this than in the whole area where we have to do something globally about the condition that our planet's in. And I'm talking about, of course, climate change and global warming. Let's look at the issues of global warming. And the word hoax has been used and bandied around fairly often by people who are opposing the whole argument from the scientists with regard to climate change. The hoax is not real. Hoax is itself a post-truth, because the greatest hoax is not about global warming. It's about the way in which we have been conned into believing that we're okay. Let's just look at the IPCC. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, is a group that's been set up way back in the 1980s to assess the thousands of scientific papers published every year by scientists all across the globe, from very different positions and very different arguments, and looking at very different pieces of research. And its aim is to inform policymakers about the state of knowledge on climate change. The IPCC identifies where there's agreement in the scientific community and where there are differences and where further research is needed. And in 6 IPCC reports, we're told that human activity is responsible for the changes in our climate and actually for global warming. And it's CO2 emissions, it's energy use, it's waste, it's overconsumption, a whole range of other things that we are actually responsible for. And yet, in spite of millions of downloads of this material, the jury is still out for some people, and some people being the climate change deniers. Looking at the next slide, 100 million downloads hasn't been enough to overcome the hundreds of millions of dollars spent by the fossil fuel industry on its climate misinformation campaign. And that's very interesting, because there you see this great generation gap. The millennials, the Gen Z, have only ever known a world full of record heat and extreme weather. Decade after decade has just shown us the planet is heating up. And there's a climate change generation gap, as we've seen so well in the activity of the young people in their marches and demonstrations, and their desperate desire for us, those decision makers, to actually get our act together. It's crucial. And yet the denial continues. You get organizations like Real Science, which are really not scientific at all, but publish their own propaganda, their own magazines and so on. And this is the kind of thing they say in this slide here. There's been no warming from the 1996 La Nina cold to the 2015 El Nino warm. That's almost 19 years of no warming during rapid CO2 growth. The scam is dead. Stop lying about it, they say. And then they make these ridiculous personal attacks on the scientists. People who lie about climate change, and that means the people who are actually warning us that we're in a desperate, precarious situation. People who lie about climate change are progressives who can't stand people being warm, happy, independent and healthy. So they think up a million mindless excuses to hurt other people, like global warming. This is dangerous stuff and frightening stuff. And there are many kind of climate science deniers across the globe who've been peddling this stuff for ages and actually capturing the imagination of people who think that they have something to say. The media, of course, have to handle this in giving us the facts and the information, and they haven't always done a good job. In fact, in many cases, the media has been challenged for presenting almost in their desire to be impartial, giving equal weight to the climate deniers, us, those millions and millions of scientists across the globe who know the truth and know the facts about global warming and climate change. Thankfully, they've stopped that now, especially the BBC, but it was like that for several decades. And then, of course, in the next slide, you see that it's not just the climate deniers who are of no particular significance but have got their little kind of axe to grind. It's even people like presidents and people in very, very high power still wondering about the meaning of climate change being themselves ambiguous, or sometimes not ambiguous, but sometimes opposed to action that will actually change the whole nature of how we do life. And the myth is established that there's somehow or another a consensus gap on global warming. They did this study in the States about 4 or 5 years ago, asking what the public thought was the reality of the situation, what they thought was the truth about global warming and about the climate change. And they came up with, in their survey, the public think that 55% of climate scientists agree on global warming. But there is this great vestige of 45% of scientists who are a bit skeptical, not sure about the facts. When in reality, and this study was published in 2013, 97% of climate scientists right across the globe agree on global warming, and that figure is considerably higher today, approaching almost 99%. So we get this extraordinary post-truth built into some of the most important and crucial debates in our world today, and post-truth holding us back as a whole global population from doing significant things that will actually prevent disaster and prevent biodiversity disappearing and prevent the heating up of our planet and landing our next generations with huge problems that they will have to maintain because of our ignorance and indifference and wrongness in terms of thinking, because we have embraced post-truth. Why do we do it? And why do those people who've got very little expertise or experience in these areas at all, why do they capture the imagination of others? Why do they get the public voice and the ears of the public when they actually have no understanding and very, very little experience? And this next cartoon probably tells us why. I'm sorry, Jeannie, your answer was correct, but Kevin shouted his incorrect answer over yours, so he gets the points. There is a final area I want to look at in terms of post-truth, which again is so significant right now, right up to date, and it's the area that comes up in our next slide, the area of the current COVID-19, the coronavirus. And post-truth world, says Bernstein, proves more harmful during a pandemic, and especially this particular kind of pandemic. And he goes on to say this: we can't treat this crisis, and that's the crisis over coronavirus, over COVID-19, the way we've treated the last 4 years of issues, and probably longer than that, with political rivals keeping conflicting sets of facts and social media outlets serving as a breeding ground for nonsensical conspiracy theories and polarization. Why can't we do it that way? Because we have a massive global crisis on our hands. We have a global pandemic. And yet, of course, even this was not understood at the beginning, and the truth about the global pandemic took quite a while to filter through. It's interesting, right at the very beginning with China. China was angry at the doctor who exposed the reality of the coronavirus. He was ostracized and actually sacked. And then, of course, he caught the virus himself and died and became a national hero. Now, all credit to the Chinese. They had the gumption, but also the morality to repent of what they said, to take it back, to apologize, and now to venerate this man for having been a whistleblower and having been somebody who breaks through in this area. Other societies have not operated the same way because they have been so much more wedded to post-truth than the Chinese. They've made it difficult for us to understand. I want you to watch this series of clips from videos on the American situation, and particularly with regard to Donald Trump and what he has been saying about the whole coronavirus from the beginning of this year to where we are now.
We have very little problem in this country at this moment.
Well, we pretty much shut it down coming in from China. We're going to see what happens, but we did shut it down, yes.
You know, a lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat, as the heat comes in. We're in great shape, though.
And in April, supposedly it dies with the hotter weather.
Looks like by April, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away. I hope that's true. And I think the numbers are going to get progressively better as we go along. We have it very much under control in this country. Because of all we've done, the risk to the American people remains very low. It's going to disappear. One day, it's like a miracle. It will disappear. It could get worse before it gets better. It could maybe go away. We'll see what happens. Nobody really knows. Now the Democrats are politicizing the coronavirus. You know that, right? Coronavirus. And this is their new hoax. The hoax is on them. I'm not talking about what's happening here. Certainly not referring to this. How could anybody refer to this? This is very serious stuff. Anybody that needs a test can have a test.
Are you concerned that the virus is getting close to the White House?
No, I'm not concerned at all. No, I'm not. It will go away. Just stay calm. It will go away. To keep new cases from entering our shores, we will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days. This is the most aggressive and comprehensive effort to confront a foreign virus in modern history. We're in great shape compared to other places. We are in really good shape. Yeah, no, I don't take responsibility at all. It's all over the world. It's incredible what's happened in such a short period of time. But I've always known this is a pandemic.
That scenario is very, very important because at very least words have to be retracted, apologies have to be given, and rightness has to be re-established. What is actually the case now here in mid-April is that the United States leads the world in COVID-19 infections. Almost 500,000 recorded cases exist in the United States by the 10th of April. And that actually approaches 30% of total world cases. Nearly 17,000 people have died out of 3 who live in the United States. And when you compare this with continents elsewhere and with countries like China, it is a massive response, massive victim response to the coronavirus. There have been 3,300 deaths in China out of 1.3 billion people in the population. And the Chinese have had the humility and the understanding to get their house in order and to sort it out and to embrace truth in this whole area. And we need to do the same. And we in the West very often, not just in European countries, but ourselves, and especially the United States, have been very slow to enter into the full meaning of the coronavirus because this post-truth has hemmed us in so many ways. This cartoon then challenges us now, and I think it's something when we need to look at what is our response as Christians to the whole issue of post-truth in our day and age. This is a law court, and how the law courts will be completely redone were post-truth to be established as the main feature of our national life. Do you swear to tell the post-truth, the whole post-truth, and nothing but the post-truth? So finally then, I want to ask, what does truth require of us as Christians? How do we actually withstand the culture that we live in today? How do we proclaim the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ into a climate that has already too easily and too readily embraced post-truth as a way of life? Well, we do it with thoughtfulness, we do it with prayer, and we do it with humility. But first of all, we look into ourselves as to what we believe, why we believe it, what we maintain, what we fight for in the public arena, and what we will actually nail our colours to. I believe that we have to have a willingness as Christians to have our own ideas, our attitudes, and our allegiances put up to scrutiny. Why do we back certain kinds of people? Why do we hold certain kinds of ideas? Why do we exhibit certain kinds of attitudes? Is it because in whole humility we have knelt before the Father and pleaded that the Holy Spirit will enlighten our minds? Or have we grabbed onto some kind of quirky sort of theology which somehow justifies our optimism and makes us go along with the leadership of others? Do we have readiness to learn from those who have experience and expertise, even if they're non-Christians? And I notice a great resistance among some Christians to learning from non-Christians because they're non-Christians. And so they come up with their own alternative ideas, which are based on very, very little work and very little understanding, and counter the experts in the field, rather than asking the more important question: to what extent can these experts in their field help us as Christians to form a bigger Christian perspective, a better Christian perspective on truth and its the part it plays in all of these areas of life? Are we ready then to change when we are wrong? Are we ready to hear from experts even when we don't want to hear the things that they're telling us? Are we ready to listen, to follow the evidence, and to weigh up what is being said? We also need a readiness to call our leaders to account, our political leaders, our religious leaders, leaders who are leading denominations, big movements, sometimes movements greatly in error because they have cultured themselves. They have latched onto some ideas that they have then become so big that they've actually minimized the whole extent of the gospel. There are so many of these little things that people grab onto and they become bigger than Jesus Christ himself and the whole gospel that God has delivered us in the Word of God. And do we then develop proper biblical theology rather than simplistic responses? And I think that's a very important calling for us today. Get our theology right, understand our scriptures, don't drag things out of context, don't latch on to simple ideas that we can then magnify and suddenly find we're going on a road to heresy rather than truth. And do we refuse to distort the contributions of other people? Do we stand by when people who have made a very important contribution to national life or international life or to truth are derided and despised? Or do we add our voice to those people who are actually supporting them? I think we have to be very cautious, and this final slide shows us something about this caution, about embracing leaders, latching onto leadership, overlooking faults, overlooking things that we know to be wrong in people. For what? For what reason? Because somehow or another we feel more comfortable, more safe, more at home with these statements that these people are making than with the truth that actually is the opposite. Of course, we don't even know whether the image here is truth or post-truth. We don't know who took it, why they took it, what is trying to be purported with that. We do know it's a piece of propaganda. It's saying that if you believe in Jesus Christ, then you also want Donald Trump as president, which of course is very, very dangerous. If you believe in Jesus Christ, you want truth. You want to follow the way, the truth, and the life. You want to be given the spirit of discernment, the spirit of obedience, and most of all, you want to let the gospel of Christ be known, that Jesus came in order to save sinners, in order to teach us how to live, in order to make us right with the Father, and in order that we will live with, by, and through truth. And there is no alternative to truthful living in the Christian life. Thanks for listening. Before I just go, I want to just suggest a few books that you might want to read if you want to follow any of this up. There are books that I've written and books that my husband's written. Alan's book, Jesus and Politics, is actually quite a significant book in this whole area. And it's really looking at the Bible, the way that Jesus comes into his own political context and how he challenges the political understandings and hierarchies of his day. Another very big book on war or peace. Alan's looking at the contribution, in fact, the part that the arms companies have made in sabotaging peace, really for a couple of 100 years. And it's certainly worth a read. It's a big fat book, so don't try and rush it. And then two books that I've written quite recently. My most recent one is just coming out, and then there's another seminar that you can look at it. Women in a Patriarchal World. Again, it's a series of Bible studies, Bible readings, trying to understand how women dealt with their culture and what that has to say to our culture today, and to those of us who are women and men. And then, of course, Scars Across Humanity, and a catalogue, really, of understandings, violence against women, and challenging what we should be doing as Christians against it. So God bless you all. Have a wonderful rest of spring harvest, and know the power of God in your lives and the love of God driving you forward and engaging you in all your relationships. Glory be to God this Easter, because Jesus is risen. He is risen indeed. Hallelujah.